Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for past Prologue, which is episode 2 of season 1 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Deep Space Nine, one episode at a time. In this video, I cover the first season episode, Past Prologue. So Past Prologue is the episode in which a Bajoran terrorist comes on the station being hunted by the Cardassians who request asylum, and happens to be a friend of Major Kira who vouches for him. So eventually Cisco does grant him asylum, but then soon after, due to some spy antics with Dr. Bashir meeting the local tailor, a Cardassian named Garak, they discover that the Bajoran is trying to buy a bomb so that he can destroy the wormhole in order to get rid of the Federation and the Cardassians. And Major Kira feels like her loyalty is divided when she discovers this, but eventually decides to help Cisco, and they capture the Bajoran terrorist who calls her a traitor. So, one thing I want to talk about before I get into the specifics of this episode is Babylon 5. Now, you might ask why I didn't talk about Babylon 5 in my review for Emissary, and that's because, well, for one, there's two reasons. For one, that video is way too long as it was, and for two, this episode always reminds me of Babylon 5, and so much it has a very low-budget syndicated feel. And to be fair, I'm mostly just talking about Season 1 and 2 of Babylon 5, which has a really cheesy syndicated feel in my humble opinion, and I think that this episode is the most syndicated episode of Deep Space Nine. That is, it feels like the most cheesiest, and I don't know, it's hard to describe what I mean. If you've seen these 90s or 80s syndicated shows, you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, so I can make a whole video. In fact, I contemplated making an entire video about how did Babylon 5 rip off Deep Space Nine? And by the way, the answer is no. So I can make an entire video about this, but I didn't want to spend the time to do so. I wanted to focus more on my Star Trek episode reviews, so I will try to keep my thoughts on this topic short, because I do want to cover this episode and not have it take up too much of this video's time. So I'll do a condensed version of my thoughts on this. If you want a more detailed version of my thoughts, you can check out my review for Babylon 5 Season 1, where I did cover this topic. So the bottom line is that Michael J. Straczynski said he wanted to sue Paramount for ripping off Babylon 5, but Warner Brothers said if he did that, it would tie up both shows in litigations, and so Babylon 5 would be trapped in development hell and never. So if he wanted the show to air, he needed to drop it. But I think Warner Brothers was lying to him. I think that the real reason why they didn't want him to sue is because they knew that they didn't really have a strong case. I've heard B5 fans who outright say, oh, DS9 is just a ripoff of Babylon 5, and they often cite things like the fact that there's two characters, or both shows have a character named Dukat and Lita, but they're spelled differently, and they're totally different characters, so I don't really think that is a very good argument. And they say that, oh, DS9 has a jump gate outside the station just like Babylon 5, but no, the wormhole is not a jump gate. A jump gate is normal, regular travel that they do. It's how they travel around. It's like their version of warp drive, and the wormhole is a portal to the other side of the freaking galaxy, so it's not even remotely close to the same thing. And also saying, oh, well, DS9 had a storyline where this guy did a coup against the government and took over Earth, and so did Babylon 5. Yeah, there was one two-parter where a Starfleet officer tried to take over Starfleet, and it lasted 2 hours before Cisco stopped it, whereas the Babylon 5 storyline was an ongoing storyline about a fascist dictatorship taking over Earth, and it lasted 2.5 seasons, 3 seasons. So again, not even remotely close to the same thing. The people are just stretching it. So here's the heart of it. Babylon 5 is about a space station that has humans are functioning in it, but it's like a diplomatic hub. It's like the galactic UN where all these different ambassadors, all these different species come to try to make peace in the galaxy. And DS9 is about a space station near a planet that just survived a 50-year Holocaust, who discovers a wormhole that takes it to the other side of the galaxy. So they try to help the planet at the same time be administrative to this passageway to the other galaxy. So two totally and completely different ideas. The only similarity is it takes place on the space station and it has a lot of alien merchants visiting. That's it. That is a very generalized idea. And here's my bigger point. The major point is that as I was watching Babylon 5, which, by the way, I did like that show, not nearly as much as I liked DS9, but I still liked it. But as I was watching it, I kept getting hit with how similar it was to TNG, how a lot of the aesthetics with the aliens and even some of the alien behaviors, even some of the specific plot lines and episodes seemed like they were kind of taken right from TNG. The biggest, most obvious example of that is in season 4 of Babylon 5. They had an episode in which a guy got captured and then tortured by a fascist government, and they were, doing psychological mind games with him while they're torturing him. It was Chain of Command Part 2. It was pretty much carbon copy of Chain of Command Part 2, and I know the argument could be, well, they're both episodes just happen to be modeled off of 1984. But the fact that TNG did it first and then they did it later, I'm sorry, that's a bit suspect. Now, I'm not saying that Babylon 5 ripped off TNG. What I am saying is Babylon 5 ripped off TNG just as much as DS9 ripped off Babylon 5, which is to say, not at all. There's just because there's some similarities, and you might call to the fact, well, how come there's two shows about a space station that came out at the same time by two networks? Well, that answer's easy because that happens in Hollywood all the time. There's two volcano movies come out at the same time, two movies about a comet hitting the Earth or asteroid hitting the Earth coming out at the same time. There's two movies about terrorists taking over the White House that come on at the same time. This has more to do with how Hollywood functions because Hollywood goes up and buys a bunch of script ideas that they just sit on and never use. So when they get wind of a rival studio coming up with this idea and pushing this movie forward, and they realize, hey, we also have a script that's similar to that idea, they push it forward and greenlight it, which I have no doubt that's exactly what happened in the case of DS9 and Babylon 5, because I heard the story once from a Hollywood insider who claimed to work for Warner Brothers. It's not corroborated, so you can take it with a grain of salt, but it makes all the sense in the world to me, is that someone was saying that Paramount and Warner Brothers were collaborating to make a network. That much we know is true. That's a fact. And so they were saying that their idea was that Warner Brothers said, oh, we have this idea that we own called Babylon 5 as a space station. Why don't we do that as a Star Trek show? So that they came up with the idea to do a space station Star Trek show, and Paramount's like, yeah, all for it. But then when the two networks split, or the two studios split, and they had a falling out and they were no longer collaborating, now Paramount still owned the rights to Star Trek, so Warner Brothers couldn't do a Star Trek space station show, but Paramount could, so they decided to go forward with it on their own. But Warner Brothers still had the rights to Babylon 5, so they're like, well, we'll just make our own space station show in order to compete with you. And so it's most likely that Babylon 5 would have never been made if it wasn't for the fact that they wanted to compete with Paramount, even though the idea of Babylon 5 definitely predated DS9, as a lot of the B5 fans like to repeat over and over again that Michael J. Skrzynski pitched it to Paramount years before, and the Paramount stole his idea. But judging by the story, I think it's a lot more complicated and more nuanced than that, and what I think is most likely definitely the case is that Babylon 5 would have never been made if it wasn't for the fact that Warner Bros. Wanted to compete with Paramount. So Babylon 5 fans should be thanking Deep Space Nine instead of calling it a ripoff. That is just my humble opinion. And to be fair, like I think a lot of B5 fans prefer B5 to DS9 is because they grew up with it, they watched it regularly, but I didn't. I actually grew up with Deep Space Nine and watched it regularly, so yeah, I do have kind of a bias towards DS9. But as I said, I do still like Babylon 5. But I just think that DS9 is obviously better. I think as far as like script writing, production value, acting, it is objectively better. That's just a fact. Now, storytelling, I think they're equal, and so that's more of a matter of opinion. But then again, as I'm saying, people have every right to like Babylon 5 better, even though it's... And part of the reason why it's objectively worse in those production values is because it had a low budget, where DS9 had that advantage of having a major budget, so that's obviously going to factor things a bit, which is why, by the way, I always wanted a reboot of Babylon 5, because I think the production value and the acting sucked, but the story was great and the story ideas were great, so if they could do a modern version of that with better production value and a more sort of shorter seasons and stuff like that, it would actually be way better than the original. But all these B5 fans are like, no, Babylon 5 was perfect, don't reboot perfection. I'm like, but it wasn't. It's any objective eye who goes back and watches it will see how cheesy 90s low budget and terrible it looks. Not to say it didn't have any good acting, it did, but still. Anyway, I talked about Babylon 5 enough. Let me get into this episode, which, as I said, does remind me a bit of Babylon 5, because I don't like the guest actor. He is, and the whole plot comes off a bit cheesy. Now, something that you'll notice from the Patreon comments, and something I've also noticed from other reviews that I watched and read on this episode, is that seems like everyone else has a higher opinion of this episode than I do. I did not care much for it. Now, it is the introduction of Elam Garak. Now, of course, he's not known as Elam. In fact, it's a little bit of a spoiler for me to say that, so my bad. Plain simple Garak, I should say. It is the introduction of Garak, who would go on to be, in my opinion, and the opinion of most DS9 fans, the best character on the show. But in Season 1, he only appears in this episode. In fact, I think it's not until Season 2, when he reappears in the episode Cardassians, that the character really comes into its own, and it's really the true origins of how the character got great. In this episode, he's okay. But it's obvious that the writers were inspired by, the film Tinker, Tenure, Soldier, Spy. I keep wanting to say Doctor Spy after the Voyager episode, but Tinker, Tenure, Soldier, Spy, about the tailor who was the spy. It seemed obvious they were inspired by that, and they made this character who's kind of shady and doing spy things and talks in like riddles, and that was pretty good. The interactions that he had with Bashir, where he would say things that were obviously implying, and Bashir was kind of naive, and it would just go over his head when he talked about the fashion of the Klingons worth watching closely. He's saying, something's up, something's going on with these Klingon women. You need to pay attention to that and into the Bajoran. And he's like, I want you to stop by my shop at 20:55 exactly to get buy a suit. And Bashir is like, it takes him a few minutes to actually get what he's saying. It's like, and Garak has to specify him, like, do you take my meeting? I want you to show up at 20:55 precisely. And finally Bashir gets it and goes to Sisko. He's like, well, Doctor, seems like I definitely think you could use a new suit. So that part was kind of cool. I did like that. Now, I had to talk about the elephant in the room. The fact that plain simple Garak was definitely played as pansexual in this episode, and then they dropped it for later episodes. Now, Andrew Robinson, who played the character of Garak, said that he decided that was a conscious choice. He said that's the only way that scene made sense to him. It was like, it sounds like, because Bashir was an attractive young man, so it's like, it sounds like he's coming on to him, so he totally upplayed that. I don't think that was the writer's intention. I think they were just trying to show, this is a spy who's trying to cozy up to a Federation officer in order to exchange information, do spy shit with, and he chose the Doctor specifically because he was young and naive. But Apparently Andrew Robinson didn't really get that and decided to play it the other way, that he was really attracted to him and was hitting on him. And I remember watching this episode for the first time when I was 13 years old, and I got that. I was like, wait, is he hitting on him? and I wasn't used to seeing like same-sex flirting in television in the 90s, so I was really thrown off by that. I was like, no, he's not hitting on him. Is he? I mean, but clearly he is. Like, he put his hands on his shoulders and was like, I am so pleased to make a new friend. And just the way it said it was so obvious. But apparently the grumpy old stick in the mud producers didn't like this, and so when they brought back Garak for future episodes, they specifically told Andrew Robinson not to do that, saying that he's not pansexual and he's not attracted to Bashir. It becomes a running sort of shipping thing, shipping Bashir and Garak amongst the fandom, which is fun. It's all well and fun to do stuff like that, but it's not canon, unfortunately, because of the producers of Rick Berman, who were too shy to do any LGBTQ stuff other than vague analogies or allegories. They weren't actually ballsy enough to actually show any sort of same-sex coupling until, to be fair, season 4 of DS9 they were willing to do it in one episode, but not as an ongoing thing. So yeah, they dropped it, and so because of that, it is officially canon that he's not pansexual and that he's not attracted to Bashir. As much as fun as it is to ship them or whatever, if you go by the material, that's just not the case, unfortunately. Now, the episode also features Lursa and B'etor, a shameless TNG cameo to try to bring in the TNG people, because this is when the shows first started. It's like their version of TNG doing the Naked Now as their second episode. Not as bad, to be sure. But yeah, it did seem kind of like a shameless cameo, and it seemed like they weren't really necessary for the plot, and they were just there because they could have had any random arms dealer who was selling Tanalos the material to make a bomb. They just had to spice it up by, let's attract the TNG fans to have Lursa and B'etor there. It actually doesn't make any sense to me why Cisco wouldn't arrest them. Like, Oda wanted to, and he was like, oh no, they haven't done anything wrong. I'm like, but Cisco, they started Klingon Civil War, and they tried to destroy the alliance between the Klingons and the Federation, and they plotted to make an alliance with the Romulans and the Klingons instead, which would have fundamentally shifted the power in the galaxy and would have really hurt the Federation. So who gives a fuck if they hadn't done anything wrong in the station? They should still be arrested and turned over to the Klingons, and especially since the Klingons are your allies. Anyway, so that was just plot contrivance of why he wouldn't arrest them. And I think that the characters at this stage, not just Bashir, but Kira, were undefined. So the main storyline involving Tanalos, I just don't think it works at all. I think the storyline of Kira having divided loyalties, or is she true to the people that she knew in the past, or is she true to her new situation, or is she just a sellout by working with the Federation? I don't think it worked. I really don't think it worked. Not that it's not a good concept, I just think its execution was terrible. Like, DS9 will do a much better job of getting into the specifics of Bajorans and like their inner politics and the terrorists and Kira's past. They'll do a much better job with all this stuff in later episodes. Like the Circle trilogy in season 2 was an amazing way to deal with the inner Bajoran politics, and there's future episodes even further down the line, like Shakar, that deals better with Kira's past and some of her terrorist friends and divided loyalties and stuff like that. what to do here just came off as cheesy, kind of half-assed, and to be fair, I think a lot of that does have to do with the fact, as I mentioned in my review for Emissary, that they didn't fully develop Bajor and the whole Bajoran situation and why the Cardassians withdrew. They didn't do a good enough job of fully fleshing that out in the first episode, and I know they're trying to flesh it out here more, but it just comes off as kind of superficial and incomplete. And the thing is that in the future, this episode is never referenced again. The Kolmach, like the terrorist group that are still attacking Cardassians and being brutal even by Bajoran standards, who even the Bajoran provisional government has, outlawed, never appear again. And Tana Los is never mentioned again. And I think that's wise. I think it's wise that they disavowed this episode because it's not a very good episode. It's not a very good portrayal. Like the actor who played Tana Los is not good. The whole thing about, I want Bajor for Bajor. So the whole thing about him trying to destroy the wormhole, the Bajorans revere the wormhole as a religious symbol. They consider it basically where their gods live. It's more than just a religious symbol. It's like Christians finding a wormhole above Earth and saying that is heaven, and they had hundreds of thousands of years of believing that's heaven, and then one goes to try to destroy it. Now you could argue, well, maybe Tana Los isn't that religious. And don't even talk about the power rapes, because that's not going to be invented for another 5 years. So let's not even mention that, because you could try to retroactively justify it by saying that, but I think that's total bullshit. It's clearly not the intention here in this episode. As I say, will be 5 years before they even come up with that idea. So you could argue then that he's not religious, or that he's just, he's an atheist or something like that. But here's the thing, and I know this isn't a complete 100% hard and fast rule for everybody that ever existed, but just in general, extremists, violent extremists, like they portray Tana Los as part of the violent extremist terrorist group, like he's one of the worst. He's Al Qaeda, he's ISIS, he's one of the worst of the worst. But I'm sorry, if we're trying to stick true to like modern times, we're making an allegory for modern times, violent extremists are almost always religious extremists as well. As I said, not a hard and fast rule that applies to absolutely everybody. But it's hard for me to believe that this Tana Los is an atheist or doesn't believe in the prophets. So it just seems inconsistent with it. Because, to be fair, and I think the real reason for this is because I don't think they did have Kaiopaka referring to the wormhole as the Celestial Temple, but I don't think they firmly established just how entrenched the wormhole is as a religious icon, a religious place. I don't think they fully established that yet, and I think the writers of this episode probably just forgot about it and weren't really focused on it. But my point is that it's now inconsistent. It's now out of place with the rest of what happened with Deep Space Nine. Now, one thing that I do really have to talk about that I mentioned when I did my season review, and I got a couple comments about it because I reviewed every episode of season 1, but a couple comments focused specifically about what I said about this episode, is the part where Major Kira calls the Admiral to complain about Sisko, and the Admiral's like, yes, Major, we'll take that under advisement. And then a couple hours later, that same Admiral calls Sisko and is like, you have a problem. That Bajoran you have working for you interrupted a staff meeting to tell us what a bad job she thought you were doing. And it's like, you need to deal with this. And Sisko's like, yes, thank you, Admiral, I will deal with it. And then later, when Sisko actually does what Kira wants to do, Kira's like, oh, thank you so much much. You're so great. I must admit I had my doubts about you, but I love the way you've handled this situation. And then Sisko's like, make sure you tell Admiral What's-Her-Face next time you talk to her. She was like, caught off guard, like, holy shit, sir. He's like, go over my head again, and I'll have yours on a platter. So, I had a couple of things to say about this. So, first of all, was Kira being kind of an asshole by going over his head to an admiral? Yes. No doubt. She was in the wrong. That was a stupid move, and it was not just stupid, but it was asshole-ish. It's not a good way to treat your commanding officer and deal with the situation. But, that being said, did that justify the way the admiral responded? Absolutely, positively not. Not only did I think, because I know we have a lot of bad and asshole admirals in Star Trek all the time, it's a common trope. But I still believe that the way she behaved is a behavior I do not buy from a Starfleet admiral. So, first of all, she calls Sisko to complain about, she interrupted a staff meeting. And as I said in my season by review, fuck your staff meeting. Like, really? Like, someone that so you're trying to make an alliance. You're trying to help. You were invited to help build this alien species. And you're trying to build a relationship, a diplomatic relationship with them, and help them out and rebuild their world in order for that one day they may join the Federation. And your response to their main representative, who is working the closest with the Starfleet, the Starfleet force that's there, is to be like, oh my god, she interrupted a staff meeting. Fuck your staff meeting. I'm sorry, but that is such asshole-ish behavior. If someone who's that vital to you has a complaint about Starfleet and you want to build a relationship with them, then you shouldn't give a shit about your goddamn staff meeting. Put your fucking staff meeting on hold, you stupid. Anyway, sorry. So that's point number one. Point number two is, well, it's related to that, is basically the way she says that Bajoran you have working for you. Doesn't that sound a little bit racist? Or I guess speciesist, if you want to be more specific. It does sound a bit speciesist, a bit racist for her to be like, oh, that Bajoran you have working for you. So yeah, that rubbed me the wrong way too. And also, thirdly, again, getting back to the point of this is an alien race that Starfleet was invited to work in, that they want to build a diplomatic relationship, they want to get on their good side, they want to build them up in order to one day join the Federation, they want to convince them that it's in their interest to join the Federation, and how they treat a potential ally like that when they come to them with a complaint, whether or not you think the complaint is justified or not, whether or not you feel like it was out of line for her to go above her commanding officer, regardless of any of that, a potential ally that you're really trying to build a relationship with comes with you with a complaint, and your response is, you need to deal with this. No, why don't you just say, Sisko, and I think she was right to tell Sisko, by the way. And I think Kira kind of should have expected that. But I think the way what she said should have been completely different. I think she should have been like, okay, so you're Bajoran, your first officer, Major Kira, not that Bajoran, don't be racist. Major Kira, because Sisko knows who Major Kira is, and she should fucking know her name if she's any good at her fucking job. Anyway, she should call Sisko and be like, Major Kira called me and she's unhappy with the way you're handling the situation. So if there's anything you can do, because having being on the Bajorans' good side is important to Starfleet, so if there's anything you can do to smooth over relations and work things out, I would I would really appreciate it if Cisco says, well, I am doing this under advisement. I think that Kara's just being unreasonable with her expectations, and she might have divided loyalties to a known terrorist. And then the Admiral might say something like, oh, well, I'll leave it in your hands to handle the situation as best you could. I just thought you should be aware that they're currently unhappy, and so let's make sure that we work this out and that we maintain good diplomatic relations with the Bajorans, which is your primary fucking job. Well, of course, she wouldn't use the word fucking, but still. So that is how that scene would have went. And the whole thing with Cisco going back to her is like, go over my head again, and I'll have yours on a platter. Felt very soap opera-ish to me. Very, like, cheesy 60s schlock kind of, I guess, kind of syndicated feel is coming from. That's just like, that's stupid. I'm sorry, that was just dumb. I didn't make Cisco come off as a badass or anything like that. I just didn't like it. And so I just didn't buy any of the stuff with Tanalos, the stuff when he was trying to destroy the wormhole. Oh, it was kind of boring. I didn't really care about it. I was like, and then you stop him. The one thing that I did think was kind of badass was when Tanalos was like holding Kira hostage. He's like, listen to me, you gotta do what I say or I'll kill her. And Cisco's like, I'm only gonna say this once. You can surrender to me now, or I'll just let the Cardassians get you because they're on their way. So you decide. And he's like, oh, fuck. And then so to surrender. So that was a badass moment, I will admit. And I did like some of the scenes between Bashir and Garak, although I will say Garak is definitely not as good here as he is in later appearances, but still, the whole thing about when he's talking to the Dora sisters, that was kind of funny. It's like, try these silk from Kraus 4, and he's like, mind your tongue, Cardassian, or I'll rip it out. Like, that was kind of funny. And the whole thing about when, he's trying to negotiate, and they like, you insult us, and like get to leave, and it's like, ladies, please, I'm just what I appear to be, a businessman trying to make the best transaction I can. So let us haggle. I always used to quote that all the time. Let us haggle. And a little bit of an insight. That's actually the first time I've heard the word haggle used before. And I was like, what does he mean by haggle? In fact, even to this day, every time I hear someone use that word, I think of that scene. I think of Garak going, haggle. So that was cool. So there are definitely some decent moments in this episode, but overall, wasn't too impressed with it. So I would now like to thank my Patreon supporters very much for supporting me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. It does help me continue with the channel, and it means a lot to me. So I'd like to give a big special thanks to Brandon Neil Howes. Thank you so much for all your support throughout the years. Very much appreciated. I would also like to give a shout out to Antarius, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Manny Jester, Joe Lavals, Alessandro Miguelicio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very much for your support. So we do have a few patron comments on this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who says, past prologue, more like vast slow slog. I don't remember this episode. Maybe it was a slow slog. I don't know. Mark, please tell me if I like this one or not. Let's put it on a scale from 1 to Vic Fontaine. I think your scale is broken. Because if 1 is the highest, and Vic Fontaine's like a -50, then yeah, I don't think your scale is any logical to me. But anyway, it's actually not a slow slog, to be fair. It is a bit cheesy and poorly written, poorly acted, but it's not a slow slog, I will say. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, I really like this episode. The best part is the introduction of Garak, who is such a great character. The story is great, is a great way to explore Kira's loyalties and mindset and her relationship with Cisco. I think the inclusion of the Dora sisters, like the appearance of Q and Loxana in later episodes, is too obvious, trying to enlarge the viewership by using established TNG characters. It would have been more logical if it was some Ferengi trader instead. I think Cisco should have arrested them right away. Even if they haven't done any crime on DS9, they are outlawed by the Klingon government, who is the main ally of the Federation. So why is there a problem with extraditing Klingons to their own government? They haven't requested asylum. At the end, there is the chase scene by warp to the wormhole. We see stars passing by through the star system. If this is the case, there should be no starfield effect, and they should have long left the system if they traveled with more than warp 1 or 2, or the Bajoran territory is much bigger and they occupy more than one system. This may seem very nitpicking, but it shows that the extension of the Bajoran space is never stated clearly. My rating is an 8 out of 10. Wow, that's a high rating for all the complaints you had. But fair enough, maybe the complaints didn't bother you that much. But to be fair, I had the same complaints at least about the Klingons. I could not agree with you more. And also the fact that they were just there as a TNG draw, which is like, yeah. Anyway, next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, I like this episode. We have the introduction of Garak, played by Andrew Robinson, who starred in the films Dirty Harry and Hellraiser. Von Armstrong played his first of 2 Cardassian characters on DS9. B'etor and Lursa sure know how to pick the wrong people to do business with. Tana Los, who works for the terrorist organization called Con-Ma. The Con-Ma reminds me of the new IRA. On July 28th, 2005, however, the IRA announced that it had ended its armed campaign and instead would pursue only peaceful means to achieve its objectives. The IRA was back in the headlines in 2015 when an investigation into the murder of a former IRA leader revealed at least some of the organizational structure of the provisional IRA was still in place. Since then, some dissident Republican groups have continued to carry out violent activities, but the main body of the IRA has largely disbanded and disarmed. At a convention, there was a panel with 3 Cardassians of DS9, Andrew Robinson, Casey Biggs, and Von Armstrong. Casey Biggs kept saying, "You are only in 3 episodes." He took it well. Von Armstrong did say his worst experience in makeup. I'm not sure which character he played. It took 3 or 4 hours to get the makeup done, and he wasn't called for a scene that day. So my rating is 7. I met Andrew Robinson twice, once in Dublin, of course, at the convention, out of 10. So, about the IRA stuff, I will take your word for it because, as I mentioned before, I don't really know anything about that. Now, as far as Von Armstrong, if people don't know who Von Armstrong is, he, at least for a while, he was the actor who played the most characters in Star Trek, all one-off characters. It was like guest starring roles. I believe his first appearance was in Heart of Glory in season 1 of TNG, where he played a Klingon. And he's played like tons of different characters, like in all of the series. He's most known for playing Admiral Forrest on Enterprise, and he also appeared as like other aliens on Enterprise, like that weird Cretacean one and the Klingon. So he was still doing multiple guest roles. But anyway, I think I heard that story about the longest makeup time that he had. It took 3 or 4 hours, and they didn't even call him for a scene that day. I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100%, but I'm pretty sure that was actually a Herodian. I'm pretty sure that was a Herodian. Although it might have been a Vidian. But I think it was a Herodian over on Voyager. But anyway. Let's see. Next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, well, this is truly the first Kira episode written more directly and without throwing in bunches of exposition like the main B story in Emissary. Given Kira's eagerness and demands to throw weight around, considering the Bajoran in question and how she calls up the Admiral truly shows, well, she is in her right, and she is at least attempting in her role as first officer in the station to certainly not simply follow Starfleet. Of course, she is outshone with Garak and his definite and obvious sexual attention to Bashir, who may in some ways may have initially hoped to just get Starfleet information, but he definitely makes it clear in his departure. Yes, he definitely wants to bang Bashir. In my first watch, I was like, oh my, I did a George Takei there, oh my. They're really doing this. I mean, after TNG's The Outcast, I figured the best it would be some token failed metaphor, and then Bashir goes to Ops all excited. I wondered for a second. Of course, he talked to the spy, was his excitement, but maybe he was, I don't know, curiously excited? I mean, it already seems in Emissary there was a little diversity in Bashir's sexual attraction, as he probably was curious not only of the Dax Trill, but most importantly the symbiont. I know these days in memes Bashir is labeled as bi or pan, and of course to this day I think the shipping of Bashir and Garak quickly became second to the long-standing shipping of Kirk and Spock, smiley face. Of course, since Garak is attracted to the innocent sap, which for all intentions is what Bashir was at the time, his argument self wasn't even conceived until more than 4 years from then. To be there at the shop while dealing with the known Klingon Civil War fugitives Lursa and B'etor was wonderful, especially when Bashir decided to tell Sisko, and he tells Bashir he thinks he needs a new suit, smiley face. Of course, now that we've seen the whole show and seen the whole lore, the most puzzling is the terrorist act to blow up the wormhole. Were some of the Bajoran sects not religious or atheistic? Because why in the world would he be that willing to blow up the Celestial Temple and think that it's a good idea? I mean, yeah, he didn't want Bajor to be part of Starfleet with the exploration, etc., but he's freaking destroying the Celestial Temple, which was just found. That, and as a second episode, a little flawed, and of course it was supposed to be the third, as it was switched with a man alone. Still, it does begin to establish the bit of issues between Sisko and Kira, which I thought was good. And of course, Garak was great. Surprised the people above did not bring him back until the second season. And hopefully it wasn't Rick Berman getting angry with the existence of a same-sex attraction conveyed by Garak. Oh well, I guess. I'll give it 8 suits to try on, much to Garak's delight, out of 10. I think it very well may have been Rick Berman not happy with having a same-sex couple. We know that he, or at least the executive, most likely him, shot it down and made it a condition of Garak reappearing is that he would not be hitting on Bashir. So unfortunately, this episode does stand out as an oddity, as I said, that it's the only time that Garak was shown as pansexual. In later episodes, they would retcon it to be like he only has a plutonic attraction to Bashir, and so unfortunately that is what I think is the official narrative, and it's because the execs like Rick Berman and too fucking chicken shit. That is the real answer. But yeah, as far as trying to destroy the Celestial Temple, that doesn't make any sense at all. So I don't know. So you said still giving it an 8 out of 10 though, so that's still a high rating. So I didn't know that this episode was switched with The Man Alone. Apparently, someone was saying that when the show used to be on Netflix, that Netflix had A Man Alone as the second episode, and this is the third episode. But I do remember watching this when it first came out, and most definitely aired right after The Emissary. So it was the second episode. Maybe they made Man Alone first. I don't know. But as I said, I'm going from air date from now on because it makes more sense for the later Trek series. So we have one more comment, this one from Ricky, who says, this episode is very boring and unremarkable. I did like the Garak scenes, and this was the episode that introduced him, and I get the feeling that he wasn't meant to be such a reoccurring character, as I feel he was going to be a one-off. For his next appearance won't be until Season 2, Episode 5, Cardassians. Anyways, the story with Kira was kind of throwaway. I always forget what this episode is about, but the one thing that bothers me the most is the scene where Kira contacts the Admiral for something, and she says that she'll look into it, and then she calls Sisko and tells him very rudely about Kira contacting her, and that she interrupted a so-called very important meeting. And I hated that she said that. The Bajoran, as if she didn't know her name, and plus you would think you would want to be helpful and respectful to an alien race that you are protecting and want to eventually join the Federation. But like I said, pretty forgettable, so my rating is a 4 out of 10. Well, Ricky has normal. We're pretty much on the same page, especially when no one else seems to be as much on the same page with me as regarding this episode. My God, could I not agree with you more about the whole interrupting a staff? Sorry, fuck your staff meeting. Like to say the Bajoran, I think, is racist, and to completely disregard the concerns, whether you think they're valid or not, of an ally that you're trying to form and trying to cultivate a relationship with, is not just bad admiraling. It goes against everything Starfleet stands for. And I think it was just done to create tension and a plot. So I think it's bad writing. Ultimately, I think it's very sloppy, very poorly written. Anyway, thank you so much, patrons, for your comments. So my rating for past Prologue out of 10 is going to be a 5 average. I was very tempted, like Ricky, to give this episode a 4 out of 10 because I don't think it's very good, but I like the Garak stuff a lot. It's not the best Garak episode, and they will perfect his character later on. But the whole thing with him haggle and the relationship with Bashir was kind of funny. And yes, it is a shame that they dropped the whole pansexual attraction to Bashir. It would have been better if they actually maintained it, if Rick Berman wasn't such a fucking coward. And some of the other aspects of the episode were well and good, like towards the end when Sisko was like, look, I can just let the Cardassians get you if you want. They can torture the fuck out of you until you die, or you can just come with me. Like, that was a badass moment, I will admit. So, and, A for effort for trying to portray Kira's backstory and having her in a bind with trying to have divided loyalties, but they just didn't do it well. They just didn't do a well execution. So I think I am being fair mainly because of Garak, I suppose. But be a little fair to this episode and go as high as a 5, which I think is high as it would go. I still think overall it's not, I would call the poor episode, not a good one. But anyway, yeah. So that is it for my review of Past Prologue. So coming up next on my channel, sticking with another DS9 episode before going back to TNG, on Thursday will be my review of A Man Alone. Saturday, I'll be over on Patreon doing a revisiting my review for Ship in a Bottle, getting back to TNG finally. And then on Monday, back here on YouTube for a public video for Babel, doing my review for the DS9 episode Babel. And on Wednesday, back to TNG for a public video this time, with my review for Aquiel. So that's what's coming up on my channel, so be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Deep Space Nine and TNG and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.